Hello there, I hope the Year of the Pig is coming along well for you. I've been a bit tardy in my video production so far this year. The reason is because I've been in Australia for a lot of the time, and I've relocated from my hometown of Sydney to the port city of Fremantle in Western Australia. Now Fremantle's a gorgeous place, and moving to the other side of Australia, and it's an enormous distance, it's like moving to another country. And that's a good thing, and I'm really enjoying getting to know Fremantle and Western Australia, and I'm sure I'll have some videos to share from this part of the world as well. But while I was packing up my house in Sydney, I came across this fabulous poster, which was, plunged me into sort of nostalgia. This was from a campaign that we created in 1991 for tourism to Vietnam. Now I'm going to guess that this was the first international tourism campaign of any scale to promote tourism to Vietnam in a Western country. And we produced it for, there were charter flights being operated with Qantas between Sydney, Melbourne and Ho Chi Minh City, just when Vietnam was opening up and Vietnamese people were starting to return home. And it's kind of cool, it's a nice campaign. I'm kind of proud of it as my first Vietnam tourism promotion. Something I've been doing in one way or another for the 28 years since. And the campaign reads, Vietnam, after the rain it shines. Not too long ago, Vietnam touched the lives of many. It was a nation writing history, a people face to face with their destiny. But life goes on, and as they believe in an old peasant saying, after the rain it shines. Vietnam is again shining. Come and see life. Come and see Vietnam. So when we came up with this in 1991, and as I say, it kind of still comes up, it still works quite well. This was the very beginning of the opening up of Vietnam. The country was still desperately poor. The Vietnam War had ended 16 years before, but the country had suffered continuing poverty. Hardline communism combined with a brutal US trade embargo meant that Vietnam was one of the poorest countries in the world, with a per capita GDP of less than $20 per month. So it was desperately poor. And we were trying to market this war-torn country as a tourism destination. Sounded pretty morbid, right? So those were the kinds of things that we wanted to kind of address with this campaign. Because when I travelled around Sydney and Melbourne with a slide projector, I'd made one journey. I'd been to Vietnam a bunch of times, but in 1991, I went to Saigon, Đà Lạt, Nha Trang, Đà Nẵng, Hội An, Huế, Hanoi, Ha Long Bay. So I did the highlights of Vietnam tour, and I shot this photo at Thiên Mu Pagoda in Huế, and I still love Thiên Mu. Thiên Mu is still one of my, it's one of the really beautifully atmospheric places of Vietnam. And in a way, Huế, the old capital, remains one of my favourite places in the country as well. But this was 1991, and as I travelled around Sydney and Melbourne with my slide projector, trying to persuade people to think about travelling to Vietnam, I got a lot of resistance. The first thing was people assumed Vietnam was dangerous. People assumed there was unexploded ordnance everywhere. So we had to dispel that myth. Of course, there is a problem with unexploded ordnance, and there still is, but it's never been something that's impacted on tourists. But unexploded US ordnance continues to maim and kill Vietnamese, particularly in central Vietnam. But as I say, it's never been an issue for travellers. The second thing was that people assumed that a country that had suffered so much would be hostile to travellers. I mean, Vietnam had suffered war from 1945 until it suffered the World War II as well, but its War of Independence ran from 45 or 46 until 1975. So this is a country that had suffered terribly at the hands of Westerners. There was an assumption that the Vietnamese people would be hostile. So that was the second thing we had to address, that this was an incredibly welcoming and friendly place. And the third thing was that people assumed that travelling to Vietnam in the early 90s would be this terribly morbid indulgence of the country's tragedy. Well, in the early 90s, poverty was definitely visible all throughout Vietnam, and look, it is to an extent today as well. And so the war's impact was also very visible in Vietnam in those years. But actually travelling in Vietnam in those years was anything but morbid. It was an incredibly inspiring place. The sense of recovery, the optimism, of the Vietnamese people was absolutely infectious, and that was the overwhelming sentiment that you experienced when you travelled. So, rather than being a morbid experience, it was really quite uplifting to see the incredible resilience of the Vietnamese people, their optimism, their sense of humour. And in a way, they remain some of the most endearing qualities that you'll encounter of the Vietnamese if you travel to Vietnam today. I was completely besotted. From mid-1990, I travelled to Vietnam for the first time, and I had the privilege of travelling back often in those years, and each time I travelled, the more enthusiastic I became. And once I became a tourist in Vietnam in 1991 for the first time, my enthusiasm was just unstoppable. And so in 1993, I started a travel company with an old mate from school. This poster, though, as I say, I think it holds up quite well after all these years. But we also ran it. We booked some light boxes at King's Cross railway station in Sydney, and we ran. It would have been 3 or 4 metres across. So it was quite an impressive sight. This Vietnam after the rain it shines light box at King's Cross railway station. And I remember visiting King's Cross railway station years later, and it was still there. So perhaps they couldn't sell the space, and they left it there. So who knows? If you were living in King's Cross in the early 90s, you might have even seen this light box. But I have to confess that while I'm rather fond of the campaign, it was not terribly successful in generating a tourism boom. It was too early. Vietnam was a hard sell for a start. And infrastructure was difficult, getting visas was difficult. In 1991, you still needed a travel permit to visit the provinces. So, it was a pretty ambitious campaign, and it didn't really produce the desired effect. Only the most intrepid of travellers ventured into Vietnam in 1991. In 1993, I started a travel company, and by then things were really starting to move, and we never really looked back after we ran our first tour, after I led a tour through Vietnam in August 1993. But it was a lovely thing to see that campaign, and as I say, I kind of feel like it was probably the very first serious international marketing promotion of Vietnam as a tourism destination. So if you know Rusty Compass, you'd know that I'm rather given to the outburst of nostalgia, and I suspect in 2019 it will be no different. Finding this poster has made me think a lot about those early years, but also 2019 is actually the 10th anniversary of Rusty Compass. It's 10 years since I published my first galleries, videos, slideshows of Vietnam for Rusty Compass. So there'll be even more cause for nostalgia than normal. And I'm also going to be running my Vietnam by the Book tour of Vietnam. I'm going to be running a couple of those later in the year. If you want to check that out, you can check out oldcompasstravel.com. I'm going to be leading, we're going to read 3 books, and we're going to follow those 3 books through the country. So if you're interested in joining me travelling in Vietnam, check out oldcompasstravel.com. And thanks very much for your interest, and see you soon.
My favourite museum, one that I've had a lot of trouble persuading my tour leaders to the merits.
I'll close out with some shots of Dom Quai Street in 1995. And for more, you can check out the blog at rustycompass.com. Thanks very much.
Someone said to us, "Are you Mr. Mark?" And it was Son. So our first meeting was Son.
It was, isn't it?
It was the end of our filming. So we've had a paint job done on the hanging wall. Turned turning left here, going to the Saigon Business Centre.